Welcome back, cadets. I'm Professor Eclipse. When 2016's Ghostbusters Answer the Call released and subsequently bombed at the box office, I was almost certain that the franchise was dead outside of the IDW comics, which was still showing solid numbers and pumping out fantastic stories set in the original continuity. In January of 2019, though, the Ghostbusters YouTube channel posted a teaser titled #GB20, which depicted an old barn with someone working on what we assumed to be a proton pack, and then the wind blows, pushing a tarp covering the car open to reveal the original Ecto 1. A new Ghostbusters movie was coming in 2020. Well, 2020 came and went. We got another trailer and excitement was building, only for COVID to take form of the Destructor and shut down all movie theaters for basically over a year. This postponed the film to 2021, but then, after an additional excruciatingly painful wait, Ghostbusters Afterlife hit theaters. The movie begins ominously with a storm cloud and a proton stream, leading to a car chase out of the Shandor Mining Corporation. We don't get a great look at the character's face, but we all know it's Egon. He reveals a ghost trap before crashing the truck he was driving after it's attacked by an unseen specter. He makes it back to the farm, though, attempting to coax whatever was chasing him to follow. He attempts to activate his trap, but it blows a fuse, forcing him to inside, where he grabs a modified PKE meter out of a drawer and hides the ghost trap. Egon then waits as the ghost smokes into his humble abode, revealing briefly a two-legged terror dog. As the PKE meter begins to indicate activity, Egon is killed by the spooky armchair. The ghost that attacked him flies off, and we cut back to the PKE meter, which activates again, leading to our incredibly sad title card. We then meet the rest of the Spanglers. Phoebe, played by McKenna Grace, is the most Egon-like of the trio. She's been losing the family's deposit on the apartment. Meanwhile, Callie Spangler, played by Carrie Coons, is giving her son Trevor, played by Finn Wolfhard, a haircut when they get a knock at the door. It's the landlord letting them know that they're evicted. Callie takes the kids on a road trip to Somerville, where, surprise, they're going to be staying for a while because they have nowhere else to live. Once they arrive, they're welcomed by an earthquake, and Phoebe immediately finds the PKE meter that was left by her grandfather. The first legacy character in the film then makes her appearance. Annie Potts reprises her role as Janine. She fills the family in on how poor Egon was, and how everything that was left to her is essentially worthless. The trio then go to an old school drive-in restaurant called Spinners, where Trevor fills out a job application and meets Lucky, his love interest for the movie. When Callie gets their order, she finds out that no one in the town really knew her father, and that to them he was simply known as the dirt farmer. Back home, a chessboard mysteriously falls to the ground, and Phoebe sets it up while Trevor explores a tetanus-laden barn. We almost see the reveal of the Ecto 1, but it gets teased away, cutting to the next morning. When Phoebe wakes up, a pawn is moved on the chessboard. She takes her turn and leaves. I guess for some reason school is in session, and Callie sends Phoebe to school even though she's probably smarter than all the teachers. Speaking of teachers, we're then introduced to Gary Gruberson, played by Paul Rudd. Gruberson plays the kind of substitute teacher that most students wish they had, because instead of teaching anything, he puts a VHS tape of Stephen King's Cujo on and steps out of the room. We're also introduced to a strange kid named Podcast, who calls himself that because of his podcast. Another earthquake occurs, and Phoebe steps into the office where Gruberson is working on some equipment. He explains that he's a seismologist and that the earthquakes that have been occurring don't match the pattern of any natural earthquake, but rather some sort of explosion, and he's there to try and solve that mystery. Later, we see Trevor making friends with Lucky, and Phoebe making friends with Podcast, who's fascinated with all things supernatural. Phoebe admits that she doesn't believe in ghosts, which prompts Podcast to take her to see the Shandor mine and exposit on how the miners all killed themselves one by dropping down the mine shaft. On the walls of the mine are very similar carvings to the statues that we saw all the way back in 1984. Cutting back to Trevor, we see him back at home in a jumpsuit, pulling the tarp off Ecto 1 in order to try and do some work on it, so he has a running vehicle that he can drive. Later that night with Phoebe, we see another move has been made on the chessboard. She makes a move, and this time she sees a piece move on its own. Then the PKE meter goes off. She follows the direction of the spiritual activity, and it takes her to the living room where she discovers a puzzle lock built into the floor of the worn-down house. She solves the puzzle, revealing the ghost trap that Egon had hidden just before he died. Jumping to the next day at school, the class is watching Child's Play, while Phoebe and Podcast try to pry open the trap. They're both shocked to realize that Gruberson actually knows what it is, calling it a ghost trap. He then explains that the 80s were basically like The Walking Dead in New York City. He shows them some previously unseen footage from the 1984 film, and then they go outside to try and open the trap using a school bus to give it a jump start. Gruberson presses the pedal and nothing happens, but then as he gives the trap a gentle slap, a terror dog bursts from the box and it makes a bum rush for the Shandor mining hieroglyphs. Gruberson takes the kids back to Phoebe's house so he can low key flirt with her mom. Podcast flips through a book and finds sketches of the terror dogs, reading more exposition about the gatekeeper, the keymaster, and Gozer. Meanwhile, Trevor, Lucky, and a handful of other teenagers all drive to the mine to hang out because that's just what you do when you live in a nowhere town. I would know. I've lived in one. Trevor and Lucky develop their relationship a bit before being interrupted by the sounds of the damned emanating from the bottom of the mine. The name Gozer is growled before a spirit shoots out of the mine shaft. At first, the teens are scared, but then they laugh it off just as quick because they ain't afraid of no ghosts. Back at the farmhouse, Phoebe is using the PKE meter again and being led to an old shed which hides a firehouse pole. She slides down the pole and discovers her grandfather's secret lab. Egon's spirit powers up the room so she can see, sending her to a closet filled with his old Ghostbusters jumpsuits and then to a proton pack on the table that needs a few repairs. This is the first time in the history of the series that we've gotten a real look at the interior of a pack. With Ghost Grandpa's help, Phoebe reassembles the pack and then goes back to her room to watch old Ghostbusters ads on YouTube, taking a moment to write down the number. The next day, Phoebe and Podcast are at an old abandoned factory testing out the proton pack. Phoebe fires the neutrona wand, completely obliterating the cans and bottles that they had set up to fire at. Before Podcast can take a turn, though, the two hear a strange noise coming from within the old factory. They go inside to discover Muncher, a blue ghost that was modeled after a tardigrade. Podcast attempts to use an Aztec death whistle on the ghost, which doesn't work as intended and instead causes Muncher to attack. Phoebe fires at the newly discovered ghost and manages to get a capture stream on it, but Podcast fumbles the trap, giving Muncher time to break free of the proton stream and bail. Back at the farm, the ghost of Egon helps Trevor get the Ecto-1 running without him realizing it, and he goes for a joyride through the fields. I should probably mention that the Ecto-1, despite looking like a rust bucket in this film, was given a complete overhaul before filming began, even going so far as throwing a Corvette engine inside it, giving it a bit more oomph. Trevor meets up with Phoebe and Podcast, and they take the Ecto-1 out to look for Muncher. Inside the Ecto, they discover a remote-controlled ghost trap and explain to Trevor that their grandfather was a Ghostbuster. The three make it into town and come across Muncher. Podcast then accidentally kicks a lever that activates a gunner seat on the car, and thus the chase begins. When I was a kid and watching the original two films, I always wondered why we never got a car chase like they had in the cartoons. My best guess is that it just wasn't very practical to film something like that back in the 80s, but I'm really glad we got that now. Anyway, they attempt to capture Muncher again, but fail, this time causing quite a bit of damage to Main Street. Muncher makes a run for the Shandor mine as they attempt to capture him one last time. This time, they get a capture stream on him, and Podcast is able to get him trapped with just seconds to spare before hitting the bridge. The poor Ecto-1. The old girl's seen better days, but at least they managed to catch the first ghost in the film. Unfortunately, it took over an hour to get to this point. That's probably my biggest gripe with this movie. Upon multiple viewings, it takes so long for the film to really start moving. It makes sense because there's a lot of characters to introduce and stuff, but taking up the entire first half of the movie is a bit much for my liking. The trio starts to head back, but get pulled over by the police and ultimately wind up detained. Phoebe suggests that they get one phone call, and who's she gonna call? The Ghostbusters. Of course. Ray answers the phone and initially says that Egon Spangler can rot in hell, but then she mentions that he died, and Ray gets upset and explains to her that Egon ran off with most of their equipment after he refused to believe him about the Shandor mine. This scene was kind of a bummer too. I really wish that they had come up with a better explanation for what happened between the group, but I guess it makes sense that Ray would be bitter. At the same time, though, of all of the rest of the guys, Ray would have been the one to actually believe Egon. The conversation is cut off when the police officer hangs up the phone on them, and their mom and Gruberson show up to bail them out of jail. Callie and Phoebe get into a fight, and Phoebe almost takes out the police chief with a proton pack like an absolute badass. But Callie stops her and takes them home, leaving the equipment and the Ecto-1 with the police in their impound. Back at the mines, wall carvings break and the terror dogs are once again unleashed. The Keymaster winds up finding Gruberson, who decided to take a Walmart pit stop to grab some ice cream after his date with Callie. In the marshmallow aisle, a big bag of Stay Puft marshmallows comes to life, and these little baby Yoda gremlin creatures cause an absolute amount of chaos. They roast each other, stab each other with kebab sticks, turn each other into s'mores, and all kinds of nonsense, because what movie doesn't need cute mascots? Gruberson comes across the terror dog chowing down on some dog food and makes a run for it with the dog giving chase, ultimately possessing him. The next day at the diner, the kids are gathered and expositing about the mines Evo Shandor and Gozer. It turns out that Evo Shandor basically built the entire town of Somerville, and in order to find out what's really going on, they're gonna have to go down into the mines. In the mines, they come across a full blown temple dedicated to Gozer, complete with a full preserved body of Evo Shandor. Across the walls are a series of years in which cataclysmic events occurred, with the next date in the line being 2021. Something was coming, and Egon knew it. They hear rumbling coming from a large pit in the center of the room. Spirits attempt to make their way out, but the spectral energy trips the trap that Egon had created. Four proton streams fire into each other, crossing within the pit and causing the ghost to be pushed back into the depths. Egon used the equipment that he ran off with to try and save the world, even though no one, even his fellow Ghostbusters, believed him. Back at the farmhouse, Callie's looking for Phoebe when she picks up the PKE meter. It begins to go off, and she follows Egon's spirit down into the secret lab, where she finds that he did care about her after all and had been keeping up with her this entire time. She doesn't get a chance to really process it though, as the essence of the gatekeeper appears and possesses her in a classic jump scare fashion. Clouds loom over Shandor Mine as the kids make it back to the farmhouse and discover that their mom is now Zool. Back at the mine, the Keymaster destroys the proton pack system that Egon had created, unleashing a mass of ghosts into the town. Phoebe then discovered what the dirt farmer had been farming. Under the dirt is a mass of ghost traps. The group then suits up and prepares to enact Egon's plan. Meanwhile, the Keymaster and Gatekeeper come in contact with each other, beginning the process to unleash Gozer, if you know what I mean. The group makes their way to the police station where they get the Ecto-1 and their gear back by using Muncher to eat the locks. The team then splits up, with Lucky heading back to the farmhouse to get things ready on that side of things, while Podcast and the Spanglers go to the Shandor mine. They make it just in time to see their mom and Gruberson turn into terror dogs and unleash Gozer once again onto their plane of existence. Evo Shandor comes back to life and welcomes the destroyer, but Gozer immediately just rips him in half like a boss. The team comes up with a plan, and Phoebe distracts Gozer with her hilarious stand-up routine while Podcast drives the remote control trap under the gatekeeper and activates it, pulling the terror dog out of their mom and making Gozer incomplete. They grab their mom and get chased down by the Keymaster, making it all the way back to the farmhouse. They lure Gozer to stand on the field of traps. Lucky blasts Gozer, and Trevor attempts to as well from the gunner seat, but the mini marshmallow gremlin creatures have messed with the equipment and it fails. When they try to activate Egon's field of traps, it fails as well, just like when Egon tried before. Gozer then takes the trap and destroys it, releasing the gatekeeper. It goes into Lucky this time, and she becomes a terror dog. Just when Gozer is about to kill Phoebe and Callie, who else would show up but the real Ghostbusters? Ray, Peter, and Winston are there, suited up and ready to show this prehistoric bitch how they do things downtown. I know some people have complaints about this scene, and I get it. Like, how did they get there so fast? Did they even know where to go? My best guess is, since Winston is rich, he probably has a private jet. And then, since Egon's tried to get in contact with Ray before, they probably know roughly where they needed to go. They shoot Gozer and attempt to cross the streams, but Gozer manages to uncross them with sheer strength, throwing the three old timers to the ground. Then, as Gozer is about to kill them, Phoebe blasts the god with her grandfather's pack. They have a blast off, and Phoebe's struggling, but then her grandfather's ghost appears and helps to steady the proton stream. I legitimately cried when I saw this moment in theaters, and even watching it at home, I still tear up. This has got to be one of the best attempts at recreating a deceased actor that I've ever seen. It mainly helps that he looks like a ghost and that they're able to hide some of that weirdness that you'd normally get through that. With the four original Ghostbusters back, they fight Gozer together. Trevor gets the Ecto-1 proton pack working, and he shoots the transformer, giving the trap the juice it needs to work. They activate the trap, and Gozer and all the ghosts are pulled in, ending Gozer's reign. The Ghostbusters and Spanglers all get their chance to say goodbye to Egon properly. I think they did a smart thing by not having Egon speak. That would have probably been too much, though even in the couple short years since this film's come out, AI has gotten so good at replicating voices that they probably could have made it work if it were made today. Though, I'm not really sure how I feel about that. Callie and Egon get a moment where Callie hugs her father. He embraces her one last time before dissolving and crossing over into the next life. They then pan to the sky, giving a final nod to Harold Ramis before cutting back to the streets of New York where Ecto 1 is driving on the bridge. And that's it. Or is it? This is the first time in the franchise's history where we get both a mid credit and post credit scene. In the mid credits, we're treated to a scene with Peter Venkman and Dana Barrett. Dana is using the old shock machine from the first movie and making Peter guess what his cards are. He guesses them perfectly, and Dana calls him out for marking the cards. The post credit scene opens with a deleted scene from the original film where the Ghostbusters are about to head to battle against Gozer and Janine gives Egon a lucky coin. He says he shouldn't take it because he might not be coming back, but she says to take it anyway because she has two. Then it cuts to present day with Janine in Winston's office talking to him about his time as a Ghostbuster. We then see Winston in the old firehouse. The Ecto 1 pulls into the building, and we're left on the containment unit in the basement flashing red before cutting to black. And that's it. Overall, I felt like Ghostbusters Afterlife was a very solid entry into the Ghostbusters universe, even if on multiple watches it felt like it drug a bit compared to the others. The way I see it, this might not have exactly been the film that most fans wanted, but it was the one that fans needed. Between all the years of a third Ghostbusters being in development hell and 2016's movie bombing and Harold Ramis passing, they had to do something if they were going to keep this franchise afloat at all. When it comes down to it, the movie was not just a Ghostbusters movie, it was a love letter to Harold Ramis's legacy as well as a son picking up the torch of his father and seeing how far he can run with it. But with that, we are completely caught up on the Ghostbusters franchise, with the exception of the cartoons and the comics. Be sure to check back though, because once Frozen Empire drops, I'm going to be doing an initial review on that film as well as a retrospective once the movie makes it to home release. If you did like this video, be sure to throw a like my way and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this drop on the channel. The next video I'm going to be doing is a retrospective on the 1991 film Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Until then though, I'm Professor Eclipse, signing off.